The sun had barely crested the jagged ridges of the distant mountains when Thomas Walker, the lonely rancher who had carved his life from the unforgiving lands of the New Mexico frontier, stepped out of his weathered cabin, boots crunching against the dry earth, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of life, or trouble. He had been living alone for years, a man whose past was as jagged and scarred as the canyons surrounding his property, a man whose heart had hardened from betrayal and loss, a man whose only companions were the horses that roamed his land and the wind that whispered secrets through the mesquite. That morning, something felt different. There was an uneasy silence that made him pause mid-step, a sense of wrongness he could not shake. As he rode along the narrow trail that led to the northern pasture, his gaze fell upon a figure suspended unnaturally among the gnarled branches of an old oak tree, the dark silhouette swaying slightly in the early breeze. His heart tightened in his chest before he could even comprehend what he was seeing. It was a young girl, perhaps no older than 16, her small frame trapped by crude ropes, and beneath her, a sign crudely carved and painted in red, letters jagged and uneven, reading, "White man don't forgive." The message, though simple, carried a weight that chilled him deeper than the morning frost ever could. Despite the foreboding warning, something in him stirred, something that was part duty, part instinct, and part the stubborn pull of humanity that refused to let a child die alone. Thomas dismounted slowly, every creak of the leather saddle echoing in the silent expanse around him, the horses shifting nervously as if they too could sense the gravity of what hung before him. He approached cautiously, eyes fixed on her face, which was partially obscured by a shock of dark hair, streaked with dust and blood. Her breathing was shallow, and she swayed slightly, limp against the ropes that had been tied with more cruelty than skill. The first instinct was to untie her, to pull her down and cradle her in his arms, but the sign haunted him, "White man don't forgive," and he paused, weighing his approach. Was this a trap, a warning, a message meant to punish him before he even touched her? But then, her eyes flicked toward him, wide, dark, and wild with a mixture of fear and defiance, and he knew she was more than just a helpless victim. She was someone who had lived in a world far harsher than he could imagine, someone who had seen horrors that would haunt even the bravest of men. He reached out a hand cautiously, speaking softly, in a voice roughened by years of solitude but unexpectedly gentle. "Hey. I won't hurt you. Let me help you." Her gaze shifted quickly back to the sign, then to the forest beyond, as if weighing an escape that was impossible. He could see the tension in her small body, every muscle coiled, every instinct screaming mistrust. Still, he inched closer, unfastening his knife and carefully cutting the ropes that held her, the frayed fibers falling to the dusty ground like forgotten warnings. When he finally lifted her from the tree, her body sagged against his chest, lighter than he expected, but heavier with the weight of whatever memory she carried. Her lips trembled, and she whispered in a voice roughened by smoke, dust, and tears, why help me?" Thomas swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. How could he explain that in this cruel, merciless land, sometimes mercy was the only law that mattered? He settled her gently onto his horse, her head resting against his shoulder, and began the slow, careful ride back to the ranch, aware of every shadow, every distant noise, knowing that someone, or something, might have left her in that tree for a reason far more dangerous than he could see. Over the next few hours, as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning haze, he noticed more about her, the hardened lines of survival etched on her small face, the way her hands instinctively flinched at every movement, the way her eyes darted to every corner of the ranch as if she feared ambush at every moment. She was Apache, unmistakably, yet different from anyone he had seen. There was a quiet intelligence in her that belied her youth, a keen sense of observation, and a resilience that was both inspiring and terrifying. By the time they reached his cabin, Thomas realized he had never felt so responsible for another human being. She was not just a child to save, she was a story, a life intertwined with dangers, with vengeance, and perhaps, with hope. Inside the cabin, he laid a blanket across the floor and helped her lie down, noting the bruises and scratches that marred her skin, the dried blood tangled in her hair. "You're safe here, for now," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. She didn't respond at first, only turned her face to the wall, whispering something in Apache, a language he didn't understand, but the sorrow and anger were universal. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a stir of purpose beyond tending the land and maintaining his lonely existence. He realized that this girl, this survivor, was going to change everything. He brought water, food, anything he could think of to make her feel even slightly secure, all while maintaining a careful balance, aware that trust was fragile and could shatter at the slightest provocation. Hours passed in tense silence, the sun slipping toward the horizon, painting the ranch in a blood-red glow that mirrored the ominous sign she had come down from. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear, and she asked, in halting English, "Why, you, help?" Thomas thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Because someone had to. Because I can." She studied him closely, then gave a half-smile, hesitant, like a fragile bird testing the air before flight. That night, he slept near the door of the cabin, restless, listening for any sounds of pursuit, any whispers of danger. And in the darkness, he realized that this encounter was not random. Someone had left her there for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it would come calling. But as he drifted toward sleep, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Hope that even in a land built on blood, betrayal, and hardship, there was a chance for redemption, for connection, for survival. And maybe, just maybe, that spark was enough to carry both of them through the trials that were coming, trials that would test courage, loyalty, and the very limits of forgiveness. He resolved, silently, that he would protect her, not because the world demanded it, but because his conscience, his very soul, would not allow him to turn away. And in that quiet promise, a story began, one that would bind a lonely rancher and a young Apache girl together in ways neither could imagine, a story of survival, of trust, and of the fragile, terrifying beauty of human connection. The wind whistled outside, carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and distant smoke. The ranch was quiet, but the world beyond it was restless. And somewhere, in that vast, unforgiving land, forces were moving, forces that would challenge everything Thomas thought he knew about danger, about loyalty, about the unforgiving law of the frontier. Yet in that small, dimly lit cabin, a fragile alliance had formed, a bond forged not in comfort but in necessity, in desperation, and in the silent understanding that life, for all its cruelty, sometimes demanded acts of courage that defied reason. And as the night deepened, Thomas Walker, lonely rancher, realized that from this moment onward, nothing about his life would ever be the same. She was no longer just a girl hanging from a tree, she was a catalyst for change, a mirror reflecting the parts of himself he had long buried, and a challenge he could not ignore. And so, as the stars began to pierce the endless sky above, he resolved silently, determinedly, that he would see this through, to the end, whatever the cost. And as the viewers of this story, if you want to see how Thomas's life intertwines with the young Apache girl, how trust and survival clash in a world that forgives no mistakes, hit that subscribe button, because the story is just beginning, and what comes next will test every limit of courage, loyalty, and human connection.